What if the most controversial royal confession of the decade didn't come from the woman the world is obsessed with, but from the man who has spent the last years drifting in silence, shadows, and scandal? What if Prince Andrew, yes, that Prince Andrew, sat down at 65 years old and said the last thing anyone expected to hear? That he and Meghan Markle shared intimate moments multiple times, and that those moments shaped decisions, reactions, and tensions no one has ever dared to explain. It sounds absurd. It sounds impossible. It sounds like something the palace would bury under 12 layers of denial before sunrise. But the truth is stranger, messier, and more emotionally explosive than anyone outside those gilded walls could imagine. And today, for the first time, we walk directly into the version of events Prince Andrew claims actually happened. The version he says he could no longer carry alone. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You might be wondering, why now? Why speak at 65 after decades of silence, missteps, regret, and palace-orchestrated quiet? What pushed him to the point where he would willingly drag his name back into the storm he worked so desperately to escape? And more importantly, what does Meghan Markle have to do with any of it? Why would Andrew connect himself to the most polarizing woman in the entire monarchy? What could he possibly gain? What truth could be so heavy that even he couldn't keep it buried anymore? The first thing to understand is this. No matter what you think of Prince Andrew, no matter what you think of Meghan Markle, no matter what you think about the royal family as a whole, there are conversations the public never hears. Conversations whispered behind closed doors, exchanged in palace hallways, or traded in cars parked behind service entrances during events too glittering to be interrupted. Conversations that could rewrite perceptions instantly if even a single line leaked to the press. Andrew says these conversations with Meghan were intimate. But what does that mean? A private confession? Emotional vulnerability? A boundary crossed? A misunderstanding that spiraled into royal chaos? And here's the part that will make you sit up a little straighter. According to Andrew, their intimacy began long before anyone realized. Not romantically, not scandalously in the way tabloids love to imagine, but in a way that, he claims, changed how he saw her and how she saw him. And if you followed royal history at all, you know that's a dangerous thing. The moment someone inside the firm sees another member differently, sympathizes with them, grows close to them, or confides in them, alliances shift. And alliances, in a family governed as much by emotion as by protocol, can cause earthquakes. Now imagine that earthquake silently growing beneath the palace floors, completely unnoticed by the rest of the royals. Imagine Andrew and Meghan in quiet corners of the same glittering events, exchanging looks that carried meanings no one else picked up on. Imagine conversations that both of them now, apparently, remember differently. Imagine Andrew holding on to versions of moments that Meghan herself might not even recall, or perhaps remembers too well. That alone should raise a question for you. How much of intimacy is real, and how much is perception? But let's not jump too far ahead. To truly understand Andrew's confession, we must go back to the beginning. Not just the beginning of Meghan's entry into the royal family, but the beginning of Andrew's unraveling. Because, according to him, the two became intertwined. He claims Meghan was one of the few people who treated him in a way that made him feel human again, long after the world, and even parts of his own family, had turned its back on him. He says she offered him conversations that were unfiltered, uncalculated, disarmingly honest. And coming from someone as guarded as Meghan, he says those moments hit him harder than they should have. But stop right here and ask yourself, why would Meghan ever confide in Andrew? Why him? Why the one person whose reputation was already a minefield by the time she entered the family? Why would she risk even a whisper of association when every move she made was already under microscopic scrutiny? Unless something else was going on. Something that drew them into unexpected emotional proximity. Something that made Meghan comfortable in ways she wasn't with anyone else. Something Andrew interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as intimacy. Think about that for a moment. Think about how many misunderstandings in history came from two people remembering the same moment differently. Think about how the same conversation can feel comforting to one person and transactional to another. Think about how easily someone drowning in disgrace can misread kindness as closeness. Think about how someone desperate to be understood might mistake politeness for warmth. And then ask yourself this: was Andrew confessing a truth, or a perception he clung to because he had nothing else left? The more he spoke, the more his voice cracked, not from fear of scandal, but from something far heavier: regret. Regret for silence. Regret for misinterpretation. Regret for moments he now believes were turning points he didn't recognize at the time. At 65, he said he could no longer live with the weight of an unspoken story. Not because he wanted sympathy, not because he wanted redemption, but because, in his words, everyone tells her story. No one ever asks about mine. He described the first time he and Meghan spoke alone as unexpectedly gentle. He said she asked him a question no one else had bothered to ask him since the lowest point of his public life. A question that made his entire chest tighten. A question that he claims made him feel something he hadn't felt in years: seen. Now, whether Meghan intended to create that effect or not is another conversation entirely, and one that we will dive into later. But Andrew insists that moment marked the beginning of their private understanding. He said their second interaction was when things became intimate. Not physically, not romantically, but emotionally. He described it as a moment when Meghan shared something about her struggles adapting to royal life. Something raw, something vulnerable, something private. And he says he responded with honesty of his own. A confession, a fear, a truth he hadn't admitted aloud, even to his siblings. That shared moment, he claims, forged a strange bond between them. One he says Meghan later pretended never existed. But pause again. Ask yourself, is this Andrew rewriting the past to soothe his ego? Is this a lonely man reaching for significance? Or is this a piece of royal history the public never knew existed? Because it wasn't scandalous enough for tabloids, but too emotionally complicated for the palace to acknowledge? This story matters now because Andrew says it does. Meghan's team reportedly denies ever having these private emotional exchanges. The palace refuses to comment. And Harry, according to insiders, dismissed Andrew's recollection as overinflated, misguided, and inappropriate. But Andrew insists he's telling the truth. Or at least his truth. So here we are, with a 65-year-old prince saying he and Meghan Markle shared intimate moments that shaped how he viewed her, how she viewed him, and how certain internal tensions unfolded behind palace doors. And whether you believe him or not, one thing cannot be denied. This confession changes the tone of everything we thought we knew about the early days of Meghan's royal journey. But here's the part that will matter most as we move forward. This confession wasn't a single statement. It wasn't a throwaway line. It wasn't an offhand remark. It was the beginning of a far larger story. A story Andrew says he's been holding on to for years. A story with details the palace never wanted discussed publicly. A story that shifts the emotional dynamics among Meghan, Harry, and Andrew in ways that will completely alter how you see each of them. Because what Andrew said next didn't just shock the people in the room. It reframed everything. And what came after, no one was prepared for. What do you do when a man who has spent years avoiding cameras, microphones, and public scrutiny suddenly leans forward and says, "There's something I need to finally admit"? Do you look him in the eyes? Do you swallow your instinct to question everything he says? Or do you brace yourself, because you can feel something coming? Something heavy, something twisted, something so far out of alignment with the royal narrative that you already know the palace would want the entire moment erased if they could? That's the exact tension that filled the room the night Andrew finally decided to talk. The night his face tightened with the weight of secrets he claimed had been rotting inside him for years. The air wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. The kind of stillness you get right before a storm breaks. And it was in that stillness that Andrew exhaled and began a story no one in the room expected him to tell. The night began quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no staff lingering in corners pretending not to listen. Just a small room, dim lighting, and the kind of hush that suggested the people there had been summoned for something delicate or dangerous. Andrew sat in a chair that looked far too fragile to hold the burden he carried. His shoulders curved inward, as if bracing for impact. And before anyone had the chance to ask him why he had come, he spoke the sentence that would shift the atmosphere entirely. "It's time someone finally hears my side." His voice was gravel, not the poised royal tone people remember from speeches, walkabouts, polo events, or charity banquets. This voice belonged to a man who had been broken down, reshaped by consequences, and forced to look inward for far longer than anyone realized. He rubbed his palms together slowly, almost painfully, as if every second that passed made the confession harder to hold. He didn't start with Meghan, not at first. Instead, he began with himself, which, in hindsight, should have been the warning sign. A man who leads with regret is a man who is about to say something reckless. "You need to understand the place I was in," he said, staring at the floor. "People think disgrace happens in a moment. It doesn't. It happens inch by inch. Conversation by conversation. Silence by silence." It was unsettling to hear him talk like that, measured, haunted, almost philosophical. The Andrew most people remember rarely spoke in metaphors. But the version sitting in that chair seemed desperate to make sense of his own downfall before anyone else could tear him apart again. He spoke about loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being physically alone, but the kind that grows when every door you knock on remains closed and every familiar face turns colder. He talked about being treated like a relic in his own family, the awkward pauses when he entered a room, the unspoken calculations happening behind eyes that once welcomed him. "You don't realize how quickly you become an inconvenience," he said. "One day you're celebrated, and the next you're something they hope the press forgets." And as he said this, his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to humiliation. Because royalty doesn't protect you from being discarded. If anything, it makes the fall more public, more violent, more permanent. Then came the moment that shifted everything. He stopped speaking, not dramatically, not theatrically, but in a way that made everyone else freeze. He looked up slowly, eyes glassy, and said, "This is why what happened with Meghan mattered more than anyone ever realized." The entire room leaned forward, because suddenly, the tone shifted. This was no longer about redemption or reputation. This was about Meghan Markle, a name that never comes without tension. According to Andrew, the beginning of their story took place long before the public ever noticed them standing in the same photograph. He claims he first saw her not at a wedding, or balcony event, or formal introduction, but in a quiet moment during an event where she wasn't yet a duchess, wasn't yet a tabloid obsession, wasn't yet a symbol of anything. Just Meghan. She stood out immediately, he said, describing her presence as sharp but warm, guarded but curious. He said she looked like someone who had trained her entire life to understand the room before she entered it. He didn't mean it as an insult, more like an observation only someone deeply familiar with palace dynamics would understand. "She saw everything," he murmured. "Everything people thought they were hiding." He leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, he looked younger, like he was reliving a memory that softened the edges of his exhaustion. He said their first interaction wasn't dramatic or flirtatious or scandalous. It was accidental, a passing comment, a shared glance during a paused conversation. A moment he claims Meghan laughed at something he said, not to charm him, but because she genuinely found it funny. "It had been years since someone laughed at anything I said," he whispered. "Years." And suddenly the pieces clicked. A man suffocating from public shame. A woman navigating the impossible labyrinth of royal expectations. Two outsiders, one by circumstance, one by personality, sharing a brief, harmless moment of human connection. But for Andrew, starved for any sense of dignity, the moment lodged itself deeper than it should have. He continued describing that night with startling clarity. The way Meghan asked him a question no one else had dared to ask him since the height of his scandals. "Are you all right?" Not in the polite, performative way royals often say it, but in a way he claims sounded sincere. He said it disarmed him, made him vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. "It was like someone opened a window in a room I'd been locked in," he said. He paused after saying that, as if the memory carried a weight he wasn't prepared for. And then he added, "It was the first intimate moment." There it was, the word again. Intimate. The one that had already set the room buzzing before he even arrived. The one that had reporters, royal watchers, and palace officials holding their breath. But when he used it here, he didn't say it with suggestiveness. He said it with a kind of aching loneliness that made the room feel colder. "Intimate doesn't have to mean physical," he said. "Authenticity is intimate." Vulnerability is intimate. Being seen is intimate. And suddenly, the revelation took a more complicated shape, because intimacy, as he described it, wasn't forbidden or scandalous. It was emotional, psychological, the kind that becomes dangerous because it blurs lines, the kind that can be misread if one person is drowning and the other is offering a single breath of air. But here's where everything shifts. Andrew said that first moment was just the beginning. The second encounter, he said slowly, was when I realized something had changed. His voice softened, turned quieter, almost hesitant. He described the setting as a formal event, stiff with protocol, where Meghan broke from the crowd to approach him deliberately. He said she lowered her voice, spoke carefully, and asked him a question about how to navigate the pressure she felt from the monarchy. She confided in me, he said, pressing a hand to his chest. That was when things became truly intimate. The room tensed, because regardless of intention, that kind of exchange between a disgraced prince and the newest royal would have sent shockwaves through palace corridors. He went on, recounting a conversation filled with insecurities Meghan allegedly shared, moments of doubt, moments of isolation, moments where she felt like no one inside the family wanted her there. Whether she actually said these things or he interpreted them through the lens of his own pain, that, of course, is unclear. But Andrew believed it wholeheartedly. He said he offered advice, not polished, not strategic, but honest. I told her I understood what it felt like to be unwanted, he whispered. And she looked at me with something like empathy. And right there, that's where the emotional landscape twisted. Because empathy between two people both battling their own wars can look a lot like connection. And connection, when filtered through loneliness, can be mistaken for intimacy. But then Andrew paused again. His breathing changed, heavier, slower, softer around the edges. The kind of breath someone takes before unveiling a truth they've carried like a bruise. He said that after that second conversation, Meghan began acknowledging him differently at events. Subtle nods, brief glances, small gestures that made him feel noticed. He insisted the gestures were innocent, kind, almost automatic. But because he was so starved for humanity, he magnified them into something deeper. I know how it sounds, he admitted. But when you have nothing, even the smallest kindness feels enormous. That sentence landed like a stone in water, slow, heavy, sending ripples across the room. Then his tone shifted for the first time. He leaned forward. His eyes sharpened. His voice lowered, as if the next words could not be spoken at full volume. But the moment that changed everything, he said, wasn't the first meeting. And it wasn't the second. He swallowed. Hard. It was the night someone walked in on us. The room froze. But what happened in that moment? That's the part the palace never wanted anyone to know. Who walked in on them? That's the question you can't shake, isn't it? The question that sticks to your thoughts like static, the one your mind refuses to drop. But before we get to that moment, the moment Andrew claims shifted the emotional gravity between him and Meghan forever, you have to understand the state he was in before she ever entered the picture. Because if you don't understand the man he was becoming, you'll never understand why a single unexpected gesture from Meghan could feel like a lifeline, or why a shared moment could become distorted into something deeper, or why, in Andrew's mind, the smallest spark of human connection could glow like a rescue fire in the darkness. And darkness is exactly what surrounded him in the years leading up to Meghan's arrival. Have you ever seen a man fall in slow motion? Not in one catastrophic drop, but in stages, quiet, creeping, humiliating stages that strip away every layer of power he thought he'd always have. That's the version of Andrew he described that night. The version who wasn't simply disgraced, he was unraveling. He said the fall didn't begin the moment the public turned on him. It began long before. With silence, with distance, with a kind of pressure that twists your mind into knots when the world stops seeing you as necessary. He said family gatherings were the first place he began to feel it. The subtle changes. The way conversations shifted when he entered a room. The way people spoke around him rather than to him. You might think royalty would cushion such things with polite smiles and carefully practiced courtesy, but Andrew said the frostiness was unmistakable. They tolerated me like a bad draft blowing in through a cracked window, he muttered. Too much effort to shut out, not quite enough to ignore. And that, right there, is where his desperation took root, not in scandal, but in isolation. He said he became a ghost long before the public treated him like one, that his siblings looked through him instead of at him, that even staff began choosing different corridors to avoid passing him. And whether those memories are accurate or tinted by shame, the emotional impact on him was real. He said he woke up each morning feeling like a man whose life was shrinking, inch by inch, behind palace walls that no longer felt like home. Every door I opened felt heavier, he said. Every hallway felt longer. That's when his routine became predictable and pitiful. Long walks he didn't want to take. Late nights in rooms he didn't want to be in. Thoughts he didn't want to think but couldn't escape from. He said he became addicted, not to substances, but to silence. Because silence was the only place he wasn't being judged. Then came the real blow. The moment the palace began quietly repositioning him. Meetings without him. Events he was no longer invited to. Photos taken strategically to crop him out. They didn't need to say it out loud, he whispered. I could feel the shift. He wasn't merely being distanced, he was being erased. And when a man who has spent his life inside a family obsessed with image realizes he is no longer part of the picture, that's when panic sets in. He described nights where he couldn't sleep, where he walked through Windsor's silent halls feeling like he was haunting the place. He said he felt like a liability, someone the family wished could be stored somewhere out of sight, out of mind, out of reach of cameras. A relic from another era, too messy to display, too complicated to acknowledge. He said he caught staff whispering about him. Soft voices, quick glances, conversations that died instantly when his footsteps approached. And each whisper deepened a wound he didn't know how to close. So when Meghan entered the family, Andrew wasn't simply a man with a tarnished reputation. He was a man starved for dignity. A man who felt forgotten. A man whose entire identity had been built around his role, his rank, his place within the family. And now that place was evaporating. People talk about royal privilege, he said, leaning forward. But the worst privilege of all is being publicly discarded. You're high enough for everyone to watch you fall, and low enough that no one wants to catch you. That's why he said Meghan struck him so deeply. Not because she was glamorous. Not because she was American. Not because she was married to his nephew. But because she had walked into the institution he was slowly being pushed out of. And instead of seeing him the way others saw him, she looked at him like a human being. Do you know what that does to a man who's been abandoned? He asked the room quietly. It confuses him. It makes him grateful. It makes him vulnerable. And vulnerability, when left unmanaged, becomes a dangerous lens that distorts a simple moment into something bigger than it is. He said he watched Meghan navigate royal life like someone dancing through a minefield. Quick on her feet, aware of every potential explosion, tense around every corner. He saw her smile politely while being examined like a specimen. He saw her nod her head while being dissected by eyes that pretended to welcome her. And in her struggle, he recognized himself. Two people on opposite ends of the public narrative, one rising, one sinking, yet both trapped in the institution's machinery. And here's the part he emphasized most. He said Meghan didn't treat him like a symbol. She didn't treat him like a scandal. She didn't treat him like a shameful headline. She treated him like someone with a story. And when someone acknowledges your story after everyone else has closed the book on you, that moment becomes something you cling to, something you revisit, something you magnify, even unintentionally. He described a specific memory that haunted him, a small moment, a moment he knows Meghan herself probably doesn't even remember. She passed him in a hallway. Briefly, quietly, gracefully, and smiled at him with what he called unusual gentleness. He said it wasn't a flirtatious smile. It wasn't performative. It was simply kind. I had forgotten what kindness felt like, he said. It startled me. He insisted that one smile carried more weight in his mind than it should have. Because kindness from someone who doesn't owe you anything can feel like salvation. And for a man drowning in disgrace, salvation is intoxicating. He said that after that smile, he began noticing every detail. The way Meghan carried herself. The way she spoke to staff. The way she navigated interactions with William and Catherine, the tension in her shoulders during formal appearances, the tightness in her smile when cameras flashed. I understood that fear, he said. I lived in it for years. He believed they shared an emotional common ground. Two outcasts, though for very different reasons, each trying to endure judgment from people who had never been judged a day in their lives. But this is where the contradiction reveals itself. Because while Andrew spoke of connection, empathy, emotional intimacy, there was an undertone he couldn't hide, the realization that this perceived bond was mostly one-sided. He admitted he never truly knew what Meghan was thinking. He never knew whether her kindness was intentional or simply politeness. He never knew whether she ever thought about him again after those brief interactions. But he felt something, and what he felt became powerful enough to reshape his memory. "A starving man will mistake crumbs for a feast," he said. And he believed Meghan had given him crumbs of humanity, crumbs he clung to like they were something more. This is when he admitted something even more startling, something that made the room shift from curiosity to unease. He said he began anticipating her presence. Not in a predatory way, not in a romantic obsession, but in a way that suggested he needed her acknowledgement to feel grounded. If she said hello, I felt okay, he confessed. If she didn't, the day felt heavier. It was the kind of emotional dependency that grows quietly, without intent, without awareness, but with enormous psychological consequences. He described one particular evening, a formal engagement crowded with royals, dignitaries, and press, where Meghan walked into the room looking overwhelmed. He saw her glance toward him. He saw hesitation. And then, according to him, he saw Meghan walk his way. She greeted him softly, discreetly, briefly. But to him, that brief exchange felt like an anchor dropping. He said he'd never admit it then, but in that moment, he felt seen again. Not by the institution, not by the public, but by someone who understood the suffocating chaos of royal expectations. And then, here comes the twist. He said that was the night everything changed. Because that was the night someone walked past the two of them, stopped abruptly, and stared. The look, he said, was not neutral, not curious, not polite. It was shocked, disapproving, eager to misinterpret. Andrew wouldn't yet reveal who it was, but he said the look alone made his heart drop into his stomach, because he knew what that look meant. He knew how fast gossip traveled through palace walls. He knew how stories became distorted in the retelling, and he knew that a single misunderstood moment could explode into something far bigger. He sat back in his chair, eyes glazed with memory, and said, "That was the moment I realized I was no longer invisible. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen us. Someone understood immediately, and they were furious." The room felt colder as he spoke, because you could tell that whoever witnessed that moment wasn't a minor figure. They were someone whose disapproval carried weight. Then Andrew leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said the line that made the entire room go still. "You want to know who walked in on us? Fine, but understand this. Once you know, everything else will make sense." He inhaled slowly. It wasn't staff. It wasn't security. It wasn't a distant relative. He paused. It was someone whose reaction changed everything. Someone whose presence made Meghan freeze. He exhaled. It was Harry. What would you have done if you were standing in that room, watching Prince Harry walk in on his uncle and his wife in the middle of what looked, from a distance, like a private, whispered exchange? Would you assume the worst? Would you feel confused? Protective? Betrayed? That moment, according to Andrew, wasn't just tense. It was the beginning of a silent war of interpretations. Because the second Harry appeared, the entire energy of the room snapped like a branch under pressure. Meghan stiffened. Andrew felt his stomach twist. And Harry, frozen with surprise and suspicion, didn't blink for a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds long enough to ignite a spark that would burn through every interaction that followed. But to understand why this moment rattled Andrew so deeply, you need to go back even further, to the real first encounter, the moment Andrew says he first noticed Meghan in a way that stuck with him. Not romantically, not scandalously, but strikingly. The moment he realized she was unlike any woman who had ever stepped into the royal machine. And that moment, according to him, happened long before the cameras even knew where to find her. It wasn't during a formal introduction. It wasn't at an engagement or a family gathering. It wasn't during an official event at all. It happened quietly, unexpectedly, at a reception Andrew almost didn't attend. A small charity gathering held in a historic London hall, filled with that particular kind of muted elegance royals use when they want to appear engaged but not indulgent. The lighting was soft, the chatter was polite, and the atmosphere was precisely the kind that Andrew found suffocating. He said he attended out of duty, not desire, drifting through the room like a shadow going through the motions. But then he noticed her. He described her entrance like a shift in temperature. Not dramatic, not flashy, but noticeable in a way that made the entire room feel slightly different. She wasn't a duchess yet. She wasn't even officially part of the family. She was simply Meghan, standing near a group of guests, laughing softly, shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning the room with quiet confidence. Andrew said he instantly clocked what made her different. She didn't look intimidated. Most people entering a royal-adjacent room for the first time either shrink or overcompensate. Meghan didn't either. She seemed centered, grounded, perfectly aware of herself. He said he watched her for a moment, not out of interest, but out of surprise. She carried herself like someone used to being observed, but not defined by the observation. That was unusual. Royals learn that posture. Celebrities cultivate it. Meghan seemed to live in it naturally. She moved like someone who knew she didn't need permission to exist, Andrew said. That's not common in our circles. He didn't speak to her that night. Not a word. He simply noticed her, the same way one notices a painting that doesn't match the room, but somehow improves it. But he said something about her stuck with him, a kind of emotional clarity, a steadiness in the way she held her gaze. And though he brushed the moment aside at the time, he admitted later that it stayed in the back of his mind like a bookmark in a book he didn't realize he'd keep returning to. The next time he saw her, things were different. It was the first time she attended a formal royal function as Harry's partner. The atmosphere was buzzing with curiosity, anticipation, and a layer of judgment so thick it almost had a scent. Andrew said he arrived late, intentionally avoiding the eager eyes of the press waiting outside. But when he entered the reception hall, his attention was immediately drawn again, not by choice, but by instinct, toward Meghan. She wasn't alone this time. She stood beside Harry, one hand lightly touching his arm, listening intently as a senior official droned on about protocol, expectations, and the importance of harmonious optics. Andrew did something he claims he rarely did around new family entrants. He watched her expression closely. Most new partners plaster on a fixed, slightly strained smile, the kind that signals a mix of politeness and panic. Meghan, he said, didn't have that look. Her smile was controlled, deliberate, but her eyes told a different story. They darted subtly, absorbing details, calculating social cues, evaluating every person in the room. It was the look of someone performing calm while inwardly bracing for the unfamiliar. It reminded Andrew, painfully, of his own early years, when he was expected to behave like he belonged, even when he had no idea what belonging meant. She had that same confusion I used to feel, he said. The same sense of being inside something everyone else already understood. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that recognition hit him in a way nothing else had for a long time. Later that evening, he found himself standing near her purely by coincidence. Meghan was speaking with a small group of guests, politely nodding through a conversation she clearly found exhausting. Andrew stood a few steps away, half engaged in his own conversation, when suddenly Meghan turned her head. Their eyes met, just for a moment, but it was the kind of moment that makes you aware of how you're being seen. He said she held his gaze for a second longer than expected, long enough for him to wonder whether she recognized something in him too. Was it curiosity? Wariness? Recognition? He didn't know, but he remembered the look. Because for the first time in years, someone in that room didn't look away from him instantly. That single moment planted the first seed of connection in his mind. A seed that, as he later admitted, probably shouldn't have been allowed to grow. Their first actual conversation happened weeks later, during another event crowded with dignitaries and royal relatives. Andrew said he found himself near Meghan once again, not intentionally, but through the strange gravitational pull of palace corridors that always seemed to loop the same people together. Meghan greeted him politely, warmly, with a kind of effortlessness that felt foreign to him. Most people approached Andrew with calculated caution. Meghan didn't, at least not in that moment. She asked him a simple question, a human question. How have you been? Not, are you enjoying the event? Not, lovely to see you. Not, busy day. But the kind of question someone asks when they want a real answer. And according to Andrew, that was enough to disarm him. I wasn't used to anyone wanting anything real from me, he said. Especially not then. Her tone wasn't flirty. It wasn't probing. It wasn't overly attentive. It was simply sincere. And sincerity, when you've been starving for it, hits like a punch you never saw coming. He told her he was fine. Out of habit, not truth. And Meghan, he said, tilted her head slightly, as if she could see beyond the rehearsed response. That tiny gesture lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. That was the moment, he admitted, that he began paying attention. It was the first time I thought, she sees more than she says, he murmured. And I didn't know what to do with that. He said he couldn't explain why, but something about her presence softened the heaviness he carried. She didn't pity him. She didn't rush through conversations with him. She didn't treat him like a fragile subject to tiptoe around. She treated him like a person. That distinction alone, he claimed, felt intimate. Which brings us back to the moment Harry walked in on them. Andrew said that before the interruption, he and Meghan were standing slightly apart from the larger crowd. Meghan had leaned in to say something the room could not hear. Something Andrew has replayed in his mind over and over again. He said he didn't even remember what she said. He only remembered the closeness, the tone, the vulnerability. Then, suddenly, Harry appeared. Andrew described it like being snapped out of a trance. Meghan pulled back instantly, her expression tightening in a flash. Andrew said he felt the shift in her posture, like someone caught touching a flame they weren't supposed to acknowledge. Harry's eyebrows shot up for a moment, then narrowed into a look Andrew couldn't read. Suspicion? Confusion? Anger? Or something far more complicated? What's going on? Harry asked, not loudly, but sharply enough to slice through the moment. Andrew said Meghan responded quickly, saying something casual, something harmless, something meant to neutralize the tension. But Harry wasn't convinced. At least, not immediately. Andrew said Harry's eyes flicked between them, analyzing, interpreting, questioning. That look, Andrew insisted, wasn't the look of a calm husband. It was the look of a man who felt blindsided. And this is where Andrew revealed something unexpected, something he said he only understood months later. Harry didn't just see us talking, he said, lowering his voice. He walked in during a moment Meghan didn't want him to see. The room held its breath. Andrew exhaled, long and slow, as if bracing himself for the next admission. Because what Meghan said to me before Harry walked in, that was the moment everything shifted. He looked down at his hands. That was the moment she told me something she'd never told anyone else in the family. He looked up, eyes dark with memory. And I've never repeated it. Until now. Then he inhaled and said, she told me the one thing she was terrified Harry would find out. What kind of secret would Meghan Markle, one of the most analyzed, scrutinized, dissected women on the planet, share with Prince Andrew, of all people? What fear could she possibly have that she couldn't tell Harry, but could whisper to a man whose own world was crumbling? Was it desperation? Vulnerability? Miscalculation? Or was it something far more unsettling? The kind of fleeting emotional honesty that slips out when pressure becomes unbearable, when the room is too quiet, when the person standing next to you is a witness rather than a judge. Whatever the reason, Andrew says that moment, the moment she breathed out the secret she didn't want Harry to know, was when everything between them shifted from casual acquaintance to something he classified as intimate. And once he said it, the room fell into the kind of silence that only comes before something explosive. He described the scene with unnerving clarity. They stood near a marble column, partially shielded by a cluster of tall floral arrangements, lavish white hydrangeas that smelled faintly of perfume and cold water. The reception hall shimmered with chandeliers, crystal glasses, and soft violin music that felt painfully out of place given the tension tightening Meghan's shoulders. Andrew said she was already visibly stressed that night, her breathing a little too shallow, her smile a little too controlled. She had been navigating a swarm of introductions, protocol corrections, and subtle power plays from senior royals who treated her more like a guest auditioning for a role than a family member to be. Then, in the middle of a conversation with a dignitary, Meghan subtly slipped away. Not dramatically, not in a panic, just quietly. Andrew happened to be nearby, leaning against a table with a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched. She approached him with a look he recognized immediately. The look of someone overwhelmed, someone craving a moment of air. "Do you ever feel like everyone is waiting for you to mess up?" she asked him abruptly. No greeting, no preamble, no polite small talk. Just that sentence, raw, whispered, trembling around the edges. Andrew said he froze for a moment because he knew exactly what she meant. He had lived in that shadow for years. He knew the suffocating expectation of failure, the way eyes followed you not with admiration but with hunger, waiting for a misstep, a rumor, a scandal they could feed on. And Meghan wasn't asking the question hypothetically. She was asking because she felt hunted, trapped, stripped down inside a gilded room where she was supposed to shine. "Yes," he answered. "More than you can imagine." She exhaled shakily. That was the first crack in the evening. The second came moments later when she leaned in, lowering her voice so softly that Andrew said he had to tilt his head to hear her clearly. "I haven't told Harry everything about how I'm coping," she said. She swallowed, her eyes glistening not with tears, but with something more like exhaustion. "And I'm scared he'll think I can't handle this." Andrew said the confession caught him off guard. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was human, real, vulnerable. Meghan wasn't talking about a personal betrayal or a dramatic secret. She was talking about fear. The fear of disappointing someone she loved. The fear of being perceived as fragile. The fear of not being enough. And here's the part that mattered most. She didn't whisper that fear to Catherine, or to the Queen, or to a senior aide, or even to Harry himself. She whispered it to Andrew. Why? That question hung in the air like smoke. Andrew insisted he didn't ask for the moment. He didn't steer it. He didn't expect it. It simply fell into his hands because he happened to be the nearest person Meghan didn't fear. She told him she didn't want Harry to worry about her, that she knew he was already under pressure, that she didn't want to add her own struggles to the weight he was carrying. And as Andrew listened, something shifted inside him. Something he didn't recognize at the time, but would later understand as the beginning of his emotional entanglement. Meghan kept talking. She said she felt like she was being judged before she even had a chance to show who she really was. She said people whispered about her like she couldn't hear them, not staff, but royals. Family. They look at me like I'm temporary, she murmured. Like I'm something Harry will outgrow. Andrew winced when he repeated that line, because he said he knew exactly which royal she was referring to by the tone of her voice. But he didn't repeat the name. Not yet. And then came the third crack, the moment things became, in Andrew's words, dangerously intimate. He said he placed a hand on the edge of the table, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to offer comfort, but comfort was something he wasn't practiced in. He wasn't the relative people confided in. He wasn't the shoulder people leaned on. He wasn't the gentle prince. And yet here she was, telling him her fears, her insecurities, her emotional struggle. And Andrew made a mistake that felt innocent in the moment, but carried enormous consequences. He mirrored her vulnerability. He told her he understood what it felt like to be judged before you spoke, to be seen as a problem before you acted, to feel like your presence strained the room. This family eats people alive, he told her quietly, and it spits out the ones who don't fit. Meghan looked at him sharply, like he had voiced a truth she wasn't supposed to hear from someone inside the royal bloodstream. A truth no one else had dared to say out loud. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," she whispered. That whisper became the emotional hinge of their connection. According to Andrew, Meghan then said something that stunned him. She leaned closer, almost without realizing it, and said, "I don't want Harry to think I'm failing. Not, I don't want him to worry. Not, I don't want to burden him. But failing." A word that carried razor edges. A word soaked in self-doubt. A word that revealed how deeply she feared the scrutiny she was under. Andrew said that hearing her use that word, fail, made something in him tighten, because that was the word the family had silently branded him with for years. And suddenly, he felt connected to her not as a relative, but as another casualty of the royal system. He told her she wasn't failing. That the family had a way of making new members feel as though they were. That the expectations placed on her were impossible, and that the judgment she felt wasn't about her. It was about control. She looked at him with something that Andrew struggled to describe. Recognition? Gratitude? Desperation? He didn't know. But that look, he said, was the beginning of everything. Because at that moment, Andrew believed they shared something rare inside the monarchy, truth. Two people who had looked behind the curtain and seen the machinery chewing through anyone who didn't fit its design. Two people carrying secrets they couldn't tell the public. Two people connected by fear, pressure, and emotional exposure. But here's where everything went off balance. As Meghan exhaled, she said the line that haunted Andrew more than anything else she ever told him. "Please don't tell Harry what I just said." That was the moment the foundation shifted. The moment the interaction stepped into a realm Andrew wasn't prepared for. He wasn't used to being trusted. He wasn't used to being confided in. He wasn't used to being given emotional access to anyone, much less to someone like Meghan, who had the world's cameras waiting to ambush her every expression. And Andrew made another mistake, the kind that happens instinctively when someone hands you a fragile truth. He promised. "Of course," he said softly. "It stays with me." That promise, he said, was his undoing. Because from that moment forward, every look, every word, every gesture from Meghan felt loaded with meaning. Meaning Andrew interpreted through the lens of that shared vulnerability. He believed they had crossed an invisible threshold into emotional intimacy. Meghan, he argued, simply needed someone to vent to. Someone who wasn't Harry. Someone inside the family who wasn't judging her. Someone who would listen without filtering her words into palace politics. Two very different needs. One very dangerous misunderstanding. And then, right as Meghan whispered that final line, right as Andrew felt the air crackle with something unspoken, that was when Harry appeared. That was when Meghan's shoulders snapped upright. That was when Andrew felt guilt surge through him, even though nothing improper had happened. That was when Harry's eyes darted between them, decoding a moment he hadn't been meant to walk in on. Andrew said Harry's expression shifted the second he saw Meghan's face. She looked startled, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because she had said something she hadn't wanted Harry to hear. Something she wasn't ready to tell him. Something that made her feel exposed. Harry misread that. He saw vulnerability and confusion on her face, and then he saw Andrew. Standing too close, looking too serious, too aware. And that's when everything tilted. Andrew said Harry's voice carried a quiet alarm when he asked, "Is everything all right?" Meghan rushed to respond, but her voice trembled. That tremor, Andrew said, was the match that lit Harry's suspicion. Meghan stepped back. Andrew stepped back. Harry stepped forward. That was the moment the dynamic between the three of them changed forever. But according to Andrew, the true turning point wasn't Harry's reaction. It was Meghan's. Because when Harry asked her what they were talking about, Meghan didn't give the answer Andrew expected. She said something that Andrew described as a complete shock. She said something that made Andrew realize she wasn't the only one keeping secrets. She said, "It was nothing. He was just telling me something he didn't want you to hear." What would you think if your spouse, your partner, the person you trust more than anyone, looked you in the eyes and said, with a shaky voice and a too quick smile, "It was nothing. He was just telling me something he didn't want you to hear"? Would you accept it? Would you laugh it off? Would you believe the words, or would you hear something else beneath them? A tremor, a hesitation, a quiet alarm? That was the moment Harry's entire face changed. Not dramatically, not angrily, but in the slow, sinking way a person's expression shifts when a truth they weren't expecting slips through someone else's tone. And Andrew, standing only inches away from them, felt the air fold in on itself. According to Andrew, Meghan's line stunned him. Not because it was cruel, not because it was calculated, but because it was the opposite of what had actually happened. Meghan wasn't repeating the truth of their conversation. She was flipping it. She wasn't revealing something Andrew had said to her. She was framing the moment as though he had confided something he didn't want Harry to hear. For Andrew, the words dropped like a stone in his stomach. Because in that instant, he realized two things simultaneously. Meghan was protecting herself from Harry's suspicion, and she was unintentionally placing Andrew in the line of fire. He said he watched Meghan's face closely. He saw the way her eyes darted briefly. Not toward him, and not toward Harry, but downward, as if she realized too late the implications of her sentence. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to correct herself but couldn't risk unraveling the thin thread of composure she was clinging to. Meghan wasn't trying to betray him. She wasn't trying to manipulate the moment. She was panicking. She had said more to Andrew than she intended, and Harry walking in at the exact wrong second had triggered a defensive instinct. One she probably didn't fully understand until the moment the words left her mouth. Harry's eyebrows lifted. A flash of confusion crossed his face. Then a flicker of something sharper. Concern, protectiveness, suspicion. Not toward Andrew, necessarily, but toward the situation. Toward the tone. Toward the way Meghan had spoken. Something he didn't want me to hear? Harry repeated slowly. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't hostile. But it carried the unmistakable weight of a man trying to understand whether he'd stepped into something he wasn't meant to see. Meghan inhaled sharply, the kind of breath someone takes when they realize their explanation needs immediate repair. Nothing serious, she said quickly. Just family stuff. Andrew saw her fingers tremble for a moment before she clasped her hands together to steady them. She looked at Harry, then at Andrew, then back at Harry again, as though mentally trying to rearrange the pieces in a way that didn't spark further questions. And here's where Andrew said something shifted inside him. For the first time, he saw Meghan not as the poised, camera-ready figure the public believed her to be, but as someone fragile, overwhelmed, and desperately trying to hold two worlds together. She wasn't protecting Andrew. She wasn't even protecting herself. She was protecting Harry, protecting his confidence in her, protecting the image she wanted him to see. That realization hit Andrew harder than anything else, not because he felt betrayed, but because he suddenly understood the emotional stakes she was juggling. But Harry didn't know that. He only saw the moment as it unfolded. He looked at Andrew with a mixture of confusion and polite distance. "Everything all right?" he asked again, softer this time. The question wasn't really about Andrew. It was about Meghan. Harry wasn't asking for details. He was asking for reassurance. Andrew nodded quickly, too quickly, he later admitted. "Of course," he said. "Just catching up." The line sounded natural enough, but in his retelling, Andrew said he could hear the crack in his own voice even now. He had been taken off guard. He wasn't prepared to lie, not even to protect Meghan. And that unpreparedness made the entire scene feel more suspicious than it actually was. Meghan stepped closer to Harry, lightly touching his arm. A small gesture meant to soothe him, to anchor him, to redirect the emotional current. "Really," she added softly, "it's nothing." Harry looked at her for a long moment, long enough to search her expression for clues she wasn't giving him. And she held the gaze with a practiced steadiness, the kind of composure someone learns after years of performing under scrutiny. But even in that steadiness, Andrew said he caught something: guilt. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had spoken without thinking. Harry eventually nodded, but the tension didn't leave his face. It simply folded itself into a quiet corner of his expression, one that Meghan clearly noticed. She leaned in and murmured something Andrew couldn't hear. Harry exhaled slowly, and the tension softened, but didn't disappear completely. The moment hung in the air like a glass ornament threatening to fall. Meghan then did something Andrew said changed everything. She gently pulled Harry away from him. Not abruptly, not anxiously, but with a kind of careful, deliberate softness that signaled she needed the moment to end. Andrew watched as they walked a few steps away. Meghan leaned in toward Harry again, speaking quietly, trying to soothe the spark she had accidentally lit. Andrew stood frozen, unsure whether he should stay, leave, or pretend he hadn't witnessed the fissure she was trying desperately to seal. He chose to step back. Just one small step. But that step, he said, felt like he was distancing himself from something fragile. Something he had never been meant to be part of. Something he knew, deep down, would haunt him. Because in that moment, Andrew realized Meghan wasn't just scared for herself. She was scared for Harry. And that fear, he said, was the real secret she didn't want him to know. But here's where the emotional contradiction strikes hardest. Even though Meghan's reaction had been rooted in panic, even though her explanation had placed Andrew in an unintended corner, even though the situation had become emotionally combustible, she still looked back at Andrew for a split second before leaving the room. Just a glance, barely a heartbeat. But in that glance, Andrew saw everything he needed to misinterpret: apology, fear, gratitude, regret. What Meghan actually felt in that moment is something only she knows. But to Andrew, that glance became a symbol of trust, of connection, of something shared. And that was the moment the entire emotional dynamic spiraled. Because Andrew didn't just remember the glance. He held on to it. He said it validated everything he felt earlier. Every confession, every vulnerable word, every tremor in her voice. He believed the glance confirmed the bond he thought they had formed. A bond that, in his mind, was deeper than casual conversation, deeper than politeness, deeper than family obligation. Andrew believed that glance proved Meghan trusted him. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The glance could have been anything. A reflex, a courtesy, a brief acknowledgement of an awkward moment, a silent, "I'm sorry you were dragged into this." But Andrew wasn't in a mental place to see it objectively. He was drowning in emotional scarcity. He was starving for significance. And Meghan, unintentionally, had just handed him the smallest drop of meaning, enough to build a story he would carry with him for months. After Harry and Meghan walked away, Andrew said he felt a rush of emotions he hadn't expected: guilt, confusion, protectiveness, and something he couldn't name. He left the room shortly after, walking alone through the hallways that had once felt like home, but now felt like a maze of judgment and whispers. And as he walked, he replayed the moment over and over again. Had he crossed a boundary? Had she? Had they both simply been vulnerable at the wrong time? Had he done something wrong by listening? Had she confided in him because she trusted him, or because she trusted no one else? Questions he couldn't answer. Questions he didn't want to answer. But the question that haunted him most was the one that Harry's expression had silently asked. Why was Meghan confiding in him? Why Andrew? Why the disgraced uncle? Why the man on the fringes of the family? Why not Catherine? Why not Charles? Why not Harry himself? Andrew's answer was simple. She saw something in me she recognized in herself. Was it true? Was it projection? Was it emotional distortion? Was it loneliness interpreting kindness as connection? Andrew didn't know. But Meghan's reaction, her glance, her panic, her whispered confession, they all blurred together into a single conclusion he couldn't shake. She trusted me with something she was terrified to tell Harry. And that conclusion became a seed that would grow into something far more complicated, a seed that would shape everything Andrew said next, a seed that would eventually lead him to believe they had a bond he would later describe as one of the most emotionally intimate connections I've ever had inside the family. And then Andrew said the line that sent a chill through the entire room that night. He said, "But the moment I realized Meghan's secret was bigger than anything I expected," he paused, "was the night she asked to meet me alone." Have you ever been asked to meet someone alone? Someone you barely know? Someone whose presence already unsettles you? Someone whose smallest gesture has the power to shift the ground under your feet? And have you ever felt, in that moment, a mixture of dread, hope, confusion, and curiosity so tangled together that you couldn't tell which emotion was pulling harder? That's exactly what Andrew described when he revealed the night Meghan asked to speak with him privately. Not in a hallway. Not in a crowd. Not in a corridor where anyone might eavesdrop or interrupt. But alone. Deliberately alone. According to Andrew, the request came unexpectedly, at the end of an evening he barely remembered because his thoughts were still tangled around the moment Harry walked in on them earlier that week. He said he had avoided Meghan afterward, not out of embarrassment, but because he feared making things worse. He didn't want Harry to misinterpret anything. He didn't want Meghan to feel uncomfortable. He didn't want his own emotions, whatever they were becoming, to lead him into perilous territory. And yet, despite his attempts to distance himself, a message reached him through a staff intermediary. "Meghan would like to speak with you privately, if you have a moment." Andrew said he froze when he saw the note. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't coded or emotional. It was simply a polite request passed along with royal neutrality. But the weight of it was enormous. Why would she want to speak with me alone? He asked the room that night. After everything? After the look on Harry's face? After the moment she panicked? Why me? He replayed the sentence dozens of times. Was she upset? Apologetic? Needing advice? Needing clarity? Or needing him to forget something she had said? He agreed to meet her. Not because he wanted to. Not because he expected anything. But because, as he said with a weary shrug, when someone confides in you once, you feel obligated to show up again. And so, later that evening, he made his way to a small side room in one of the quieter wings of the residence, an unremarkable space, used for overflow guests, storage, or private phone calls. A space without cameras, without staff, without eyes. He entered first. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp on a side table. The curtains were drawn. There was no sound except the faint hum of ventilation. Andrew said he stood near the center of the room, unsure whether to sit or wait. He felt a pressure in his chest, not fear exactly, but the tightening feeling of someone preparing to walk into emotional quicksand. And then the door opened. Meghan stepped inside quietly, closing it behind her with a soft click that echoed louder in Andrew's mind than it probably did in reality. She wasn't dressed formally this time. No elegant gown. No pristine tailoring. Just a simple blouse and soft trousers. Clothes meant for comfort, not performance. And there, according to Andrew, was the first sign that this wasn't a conversation meant for royal optics. This wasn't about public image. This was about something rawer, something heavier. She didn't greet him immediately. She looked down for a moment, gathering herself. Then she lifted her gaze and said softly, "Thank you for coming." Andrew nodded, unsure whether he should speak or wait. He chose to wait, and Meghan stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as though approaching a fragile object. The first thing she said wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an explanation. It was a confession. "I shouldn't have said what I did in front of Harry," she said. "It wasn't fair to you." Andrew blinked, startled. Meghan continued, "I wasn't thinking clearly. I panicked, and I made it sound like you were hiding something from him when you weren't." Andrew felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly, not because he needed the apology, but because he needed clarity. He needed to know she hadn't placed him in that situation on purpose. But then she added something he didn't expect. "I didn't want Harry to worry about me," she said quietly, "and I didn't want him to know how overwhelmed I am." She hesitated. "I'm not used to feeling weak, and I don't want him to see me that way." Andrew nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. Meghan took a breath. "And I know I shouldn't have involved you. I know it wasn't fair. But I needed someone to talk to." That sentence hit Andrew like a shockwave. Not because it was dramatic. Not because it was flirty. Not because it was scandalous. But because it was emotional. It was vulnerable. It was intimate. Here she was, Meghan Markle, the woman the world scrutinized relentlessly, telling him she needed someone. Needed him. That she had chosen him instead of anyone else in the family. That she trusted him with feelings she couldn't share with Harry. Andrew said he swallowed hard. "Why me?" he asked her. "There are people much closer to you. People who know you better." Meghan shook her head. "I can't talk to them," she said. "Not about this. Not about how I'm really handling things." Her eyes met his. "But you understand what it feels like to be judged, to be misunderstood, to be watched." She exhaled. "And you don't look at me the way they do." Here is where everything twisted. Because Andrew said that sentence, "You don't look at me the way they do," unlocked something inside him. Something cautious. Something tender. Something he didn't want to examine too closely. And it was that emotional shift, he said, that marked the beginning of what he would later describe